Welcome to the Journal of Stories podcast, where I, Elder Van Cott, a service missionary from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, collect wisdom from people with good stories to tell about their lives. Join me in expanding your knowledge of the world and growing your faith through listening to and learning from the most interesting stories from other people's experience, which will add to your own story and extend the stories of those I interview. So, get ready to learn and grow from this entry out of the Journal of Stories. All right, thanks for coming on the podcast with me today. You are the very first guest of this little idea that I've had for a podcast, and this is the first one where I'm actually trying to make it happen. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'm pleased to help. Hopefully, when we're done here, you won't regret it.
I don't think I will at all. All right. So the purpose of this podcast is to get stories from the guests that I have on here. If you don't feel like sharing a story that I ask about, feel free not to. And I'm excited to get to know more about you today. The first question I have for you today is one that I had when I was researching for your intro. And it is, because I don't use your first name, when I asked for it from your partner, she told me that you didn't use your first name, that you use a different one instead. So what's the story behind that?
Okay. I'm named after my father, whose first name is Fred. And my middle name is Robert, who's his father's name. Well, growing up, his name is Fred R. Stewart. Mine's Fred Robert Stewart. And I would always fill things out as Fred Robert Stewart, hoping that whoever sent me mail would leave the middle name in, but they wouldn't. They'd always short it to initial. So my father would receive my mail, and he would open it, and then he'd call me in and ask me if this was mine. And I thought, well, I'm going to start going by my middle name so I don't have this problem. And so I did that when I went off to college, which was kind of not very insightful because I was no longer home and my mail was no longer going to my home. So growing up, I went by Fred and by a family nickname. And then when I left home, I started going by, I started going by Bob because my grandfather went by Bob. But I had a roommate who called me Rob instead. And when he met the young lady I was dating who became my wife, he called me Rob. And so she started calling me Rob. So there's an evolution.
Yeah.
So, and my nickname, I might as well, since it's a podcast and sharing it with everyone, my nickname is Chief. My siblings didn't know I had a different name than that. So.
Interesting. That's really cool.
Yeah. There's a story. I was helping out. I had not gotten my PE credit in high school till I was a senior, and then looking through records, I was told I couldn't graduate without the PE credit. And since there was nothing that fit in with the classes I was taking of small high school, they put me in to help teach the PE class with the principal who taught the PE class. Oh. And so when he was doing principal stuff, I was running the class. And one of the young men in the class is good friends with one of my younger brothers. And he was always talking with my brother about Fred this and Fred that. And my young brother finally said, "Andy, who is this Fred you were talking about?" He goes, "Your brother, you big dummy." But he didn't know who Fred was. I was Chief to him.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's
awesome.
Story of my names.
Yeah. Very interesting. All righty. Well, the next question I have for you is kind of the one that kicks off the whole podcast, and that is, what is your story? And start from the beginning.
Oh, wow. My story. I guess beginning would be, wow, you go a long ways back, of course, a person could. My mom's comes from the long line of people, like many people do here in the United States, who have ancestors back in the New England states, the Mayflower and, all of that. And my dad's line converts in England and Scotland came over as converts to the church in the late 1800s. My dad was in the World War II, and after the war, he got involved with farming. And my mom was teaching school up in a little high school up in Idaho. And my dad acquired a farm up there. And so he met my mother there in that community while he was farming, and she was a school teacher. And they got married, and that's where they settled, and that's where I was raised, in a little farming community in Idaho called Hunt, Idaho. Hunt, Idaho was a Japanese relocation center during World War II. And then after the war, those unfortunate Japanese people were able to go try to get their lives going somewhere else, and veterans were able to draw out for farmland. And so everyone where I grew up were World War II veterans, and some were Korean War veterans. So it was quite a unusual demographic. Everybody was farmers, so it was all families. There was no widows. If somebody's husband died, then they would sell the farm and move. So it was just families. And they had a little tiny ward. There's enough active members. It was a very small ward. It was 115 members when I went on my mission. And you knew everyone with 115 members. And it was just a very close-knit community. People there. My mother had her 90th anniversary a few years ago, and for the birthday, these old timers, people my age and older, came back for that, and it was a lot more of a reunion than a high school reunion, as far as I was concerned. Just people you knew that were close to you. So that's the start of my story. So from there, grew up there on the farm, went off to college for a year at Rick's College, now BYU, Idaho, served a mission in Sweden, came back, started school down at BYU in Provo. I met my wife there. She had already graduated and was come back after her mission, and was living with her roommates, and we met at church in the Provo High School, which is where our ward was. And we got married, and we went to Utah State. I finished school up there, worked for the Soil Conservation Service for a couple of years, and they got hired with Utah Power, now Rocky Mountain Power, and spent my career close to 40 years with them. And then retired a year ago and got called to this mission, and here I am. So there's my story in short. And there's a lot of course, pieces I didn't include.
Of course, yeah. Specifically, could you expand on maybe your mission? Because I know that's an important part in my current part of my life. So
Sure, yeah. So I was called to Sweden. I was going to Rick's at the time. I submitted my papers, but I submitted them through my bishop at my home. And so the mission call came to my parents' home there on the farm. And my father, I'm the oldest boy, and so he was so excited. He opened my mission call. He read it, and he called me, and I wasn't there, so he left word with my roommates about my mission call. So that's how I learned where I was going on my missions. My roommates told me.
Yeah.
And I was excited. I didn't think anything of it. My younger brothers, however, informed him that under no circumstances was he to open their calls when they got their calls. But fortunately, me and my dad were the same mind. We're just excited. So I got called to Sweden. Happened to be one of the young men living in an apartment next to us was Peter Bergstrom, whose mother taught in the MTC. The LTM, Language Training Mission. The Scandinavian Language Training Mission was at Rexburg at that time. They were just building the new Language Training Mission in Provo, which now is a missionary training center, the MTC, as opposed to the LTM.
Interesting.
And just before I came, before I entered, it was moved to Provo, and which was a good thing because 3 days after I started my mission, the Teton Dam broke and flooded Rexburg and the area. And so it would have truly disrupted the MTC, the LTM at that time. So, So we were living in the Helaman Halls because the new LTM was not finished. And we were eating in the cafeteria there. And then one day they had a meeting. I don't even remember where we met. But someone says, we have some good news and some bad news. The good news is you're moving up to the new LTM. Lots of cheering. And then the bad news is there's no hot water or air conditioning. So this happened to be late June and pretty hot in Provo. And so the cold showers weren't such a bad thing because with no air conditioning, they kind of felt good.
Yeah.
The cafeteria wasn't open, and where they normally have an exercise program, our time for that was all taken up walking down to BYU campus to the cafeteria down there for our meals. So that's where I served learned early, started on the language. You don't learn it, you just get some fundamentals. And then I was sent to Sweden, and that was an exciting time. I'd never been on a commercial airplane before that. And when we landed in Kennedy International, a hurricane was coming up the coast. And so they were consolidating flights, moving people up so they could get out before the hurricane. And ours was the last flight from Scandinavian Airlines out. It was one of those big jumbo jets with the 3 seats and the 5 and the 3. And it was packed. There was not an empty seat on the whole plane. And as it took off, I remember looking out at the wings, and the gusts of the weather was coming, and the wingtips would flip up as gusts would hit it. And then a down gust would hit, and the wingtips would flip down. And then they'd flip up, and I thought, wow, it looks like this thing's flying. So I definitely remember that. And then, of course, we arrived in Sweden, stopped in Denmark, changed planes, flew up to Stockholm. Our mission president met us. They spent a night at the mission home. They actually put us up in the basement of the mission home. There's a bunch of cots, and the elders were down there, and the sisters were upstairs in a bedroom. And then they put me on a train the next morning for a town called Sollefteå. And they told me that the district leader would meet me in a town, Sundsvall it happens to be, and help me transfer to the bus that takes me to Sollefteå. So they did meet me, and he's a big fellow, Elder Stewart, warm-hearted, enjoyed his fun, and he told me how my companion I was going to see had a broken collarbone, that some guys had jumped him and mugged him, and I was pretty naive and swallowed it all, and he felt bad, and he apologized and says, no, he just ran off the road on his bike and broke his collarbone. I really wasn't going to a rough neighborhood. There weren't any rough neighborhoods at that point in time in Sweden. And so they put me on the bus. We get somewhere up there, and the bus stops, and everybody gets off, and I'm panicked because it was in Härnösand. It wasn't Sollefteå. And I promptly forgot any Swedish I ever knew. And I says, does anyone speak English? And the young man said he did. I says, how do I go to Sollefteå? And he says, I think you get on that bus up there. So I got on the other bus, which nobody even realized I had to transfer, and got on the bus. I get to Sollefteå. The bus stops. There's nothing around where we stopped. There's no phone. Besides, if I had a phone, I wouldn't know who to call. I didn't have any numbers. And I hung around there for a couple hours before my companion came and found me. I'm just sitting on a bench, nobody around, just hoping somebody told him. And my companion did show up, and he was a wonderful elder, Elder Jackson. And I only had him for a month, but I couldn't have had a better first companion. He had a sense of humor as well. We sat down for breakfast the first morning, and the containers, the milk and you would have were cardboard. They're like the containers we have that up in Cache Valley, there's a company that sells the milk that doesn't need to be pasteurized. I don't know if you've seen those. They're about so high and so thick and so wide. They're just rectangular.
Yeah. And
a lot of things came in that in Sweden. You had regular milk that came in that. And well, this stuff, I didn't know any different. I went to pour it on my cereal, and instead of pouring out, it just kind of bulged. And I tipped it back up, and it rolled back in the container. And I says, what's this? And he goes, it's milk. And I did it again. I says, no, really, what is this? Milk. He says, milk's different in Sweden. I says, Elder, I grew up on a farm milking cows, and this is not milk. He laughed. He says, it's okay. It's a cultured milk. It's called Longfield. It's good. Go ahead and use it. So my introduction to Longfield.
Interesting.
And then the first P Day we had, we went and picked some wild berries, lingonberries. Swedes are very proud of their lingonberries. It'd be most comparable to cranberry. But lingon jam, if anybody's Swedish, they know lingon jam. And we picked that, and we bought a little carton of ice cream and ate it with that. And then they had a surströmming. The members had a surströmming party. Surströmming is a Strumming is herring, and surstrumming would be sour herring, I guess, but it stinks terribly. When you actually buy the cans of surstrumming, they're bulged. And he knew about it, and he was looking forward to the cultural influence. Of course, I'm totally green. I have no idea. And the members had a party, but didn't invite us out of courtesy. But to us, it was exclusion. And so we went and thought, well, we'll have our own party. Or my companion did, and I was gung-ho, so I went along with it. Well, he was from Wyoming. I was from a farm. We were both quite naive as far as this goes. And you open this can, and horrible smell, horrible taste, it turns out. So we sit down to eat this, and we're eating it straight out of the can. Unbeknownst, we learned later how you actually eat it. And I took a bite, and I got it down, and I got the second bite in my mouth. I thought, if I try to swallow this, I'm going to vomit. So I spit it out and says, I'm sorry, Elder, I can't do this. Well, he sat there and ate a second bite, and he got a third bite, and he says, if a Swede can eat it, so can I. And then he thought, well, maybe you cook it. Never try to fry something that stinks. It just makes it worse. Oh. I went in the other room and stuck towels around the door to try to keep the smell out. Oh. Finally, he conceded defeat and threw it away. He says, I don't know how they do it. Well, we found out later, the reason you have a party is one can does 20 people. And you take their cracker bread and you put potatoes on it and onions on it, garlic on it, a little bit of surströmming. So it's kind of like eating salt by the spoonful instead of,
I see.
It was just, so the members said nobody ever eats it straight. And so all of a sudden we were quite proud of ourselves. I don't know why you would. Missionaries are young and they're young. Let's just leave it at that. So anyway, served there. It was a small branch. It wasn't even a branch. It was just had a presiding elder. There's the presiding elder and his wife and their baby, his father and mother, another couple, and a widow. And that was the total number of people in that little unit. We met in the bottom of a former bank. The presiding elder's office was a bank vault. I mean, it was a door, big heavy door with the rods that go out.
Wow.
And so the branch records were secure. But I was there for a little while, and then I was transferred to a place called Team Roll, which was happened to be, as far as I can tell, the paper mill capital of this country. I don't know if you've ever smelled a paper mill. They smell awful. And there were 3 of them. And so unless the wind blew, and they were all different directions from town. So unless the wind blew from the right direction, you're downwind of a paper mill. But you kind of get used to it. But the beauty of the place was I was there for 9 months, and we ended up baptizing 3 people, which is fairly significant for Sweden. And so I have a lot of sweet, tender moments. You worked hard and discouraged often, but when you have a baptism, it's just so very, very sweet. And so a young mother who, as common in Sweden, was never married. She had a little girl, Ulrika, and her name was Marie. Her boyfriend, when she was working for a pastry shop, and he didn't like how strict the pastry shop owner was, and he left her. And so it was just her and the little girl. And the pastry shop owner, our district leader, it was in a nearby town called Sundsvall, he had come out with a referral. And my senior companion and he had gone to this pastry shop where the referral was, as Fru Åberg. Fru means Mrs., and it was Fru Åberg's pastry shop, Konditori. It was a pastry shop for konditori's. And she thought they were trevliga pojkar, nice boys, and she gave them a nice big pastry. And so they brought it home and brought it to our apartment. We all ate it, and it was great. So a couple of nights later, my companion says, we're going to go visit her again. I thought, Elder, we don't just go eat pastries, but we went there anyway. And she was a Christian, and she wanted her employees to be Christians. And so she encouraged us to teach her employees, and this Marie was one of her employees and was a golden investigator.
Oh yeah.
It's interesting how though we spent a lot of time knocking on doors, the people we taught were never people we met by knocking on doors. I think the Lord blesses us to have success when we're obedient. And he arranges how we can have the blessing, even though what he's asked us to do doesn't get us there. It keeps us. It enables us to be blessed. Yeah. So, Fru O'Berry was the one who introduced us to Marie, and then the other lady we were tracting. The other two we baptized. We were tracting and met a lady who was not real emotionally sound, and she. We taught her a little bit, but her daughter was there one time, and the daughter lived with her mother, the mother's mother, the daughter's grandmother. So there's a grandmother and a granddaughter, and the granddaughter said she thought her grandmother would like our message. So that's how we met her, and we taught the grandmother. And when the grandmother finally decided to be baptized, the granddaughter says she wanted to be baptized too. She sat there during all the discussions, never said a word, but she had been taught everything. Mm-hmm. And so those were two others. And there's a sweet miracle that happened with both of those. The grandmother had cataracts. And she had left the state church, which is the Lutheran church, and become Seventh-day Adventist. Well, unknown to us till later, she told us she felt the Lord, was afraid the Lord would be thinking she was wishy-washy, that she had been a member of a church and then another church and now a third church. So if he was pleased with her, if this was the right decision, that he would let her know. And the prayer she had in her heart unexpressed was that he would remove her cataracts to let her know. So she told us later, after her baptism, that when she came out of the water, she thought she could see better. But she knew she was excited and thought, maybe I'm just excited. She waited until she got home, and she knew in her kitchen, she had little sayings, needle point sayings on her wall. Mm-hmm. And she knew how close she had to be to read them, but she could read them from clear across the room. So that miracle had come to her. Faith precedes the miracle. It was very much the case. Her granddaughter also had a desire and had the similar concerns. And she had a tumor that was going to be operated on. And she had actually checked into the hospital the night before. She was supposed to, but she was allowed to leave. So she was picked up and brought, and she was baptized. Mm-hmm. She went back in the hospital. The operation was for the following morning. And the surgeon felt impressed to just do another look, and the tumor was gone. So two people had miracles because of their faith. Wow. It was pretty neat. Mm-hmm. So, and then I served down in a place called Lidingö. It's an island right there by Stockholm. And it was wealthy people, and nobody was home, and it was very tedious, and nothing was happening, very discouraging. And while we're out walking one day, a fellow stopped in his car, and he says, "Are you looking for me?" And we says, "We don't know. Who are you?" And he had been taught in southern Sweden and come up to Stockholm as a student, and he was supposed to have had his name referred to the missionaries. Well, it hadn't gotten to us, but he found us. And so we taught him and baptized him. And so yeah, that was wonderful, of course. And we baptized him in the ocean. He wanted to be baptized in the ocean. And so I had that privilege. And I don't know, it was just the spirit was warm or if the water was warm, but it felt warm to me. Yeah. So, and then there was one other baptism by members had a young woman living with them, exchange student who was baptized. But we taught her. But again, there was we didn't find her. It was just the Lord knows what He's doing, and He helps us. Yeah, for sure. And then when I flew home, I spent, I served elsewhere, and one place was out in Örebro, which is an inland city off a big inland sea, which really is in winter really cold. Nothing really happened out there, but after I met my wife and married her, she has ancestry from there. So thought, well, maybe there was a purpose for it. I'm not really sure, but
Yeah.
so, and then came home. At the day, those no TSA at that time, at least not security, anything. The plane lands on the tarmac in Salt Lake. They roll up the stairs. You walk down the stairs, and your family's out right there and can run up and greet you.
None.
I have 3 younger sisters who are 2 years apart. And the oldest of them got thinking that I've been gone and that I might not recognize her because each one's, the next one younger will be her age. And so she put on makeup and a nice dress and everything and ran up and hugged me. I didn't know who she was, as much what she was counting on. And I'm standing there not wanting to be rude, and I'm looking at my mom, and I'm pointing at her going, "Mom, help." I haven't hugged a girl in 2 years, and certainly not going to hug a girl I don't know. So, but it turns out it's my sister, and she got a good laugh out of it.
Yeah.
So, and then my dad had some business to do in Salt Lake, and he told my mother as she took me home to stop in and see the stake press and get me released that night because I had to go out and move pipe in the morning. The farm, there's farm work to do. So my transition was pretty simple. It was go to bed, get up, and go back to work. So that was there's my story, mission story in short.
Yeah, that's awesome. I guess my next, or the next thing I want to know more about is your immediate family. What was the situation? I'm trying to think of a good word. I've got the stage jitters, I guess.
My parents and my siblings?
Yeah, just the configuration, yeah.
So my mom and dad, my mom had endometriosis bad and had one of her ovaries removed, and the doctor said she'd never have children. But both her patriarchal blessing, my father's patriarchal blessings promised them children. And they fasted and prayed, and finally, after a couple of years, almost 3, my sister was born. And they told her that if you keep having children, it improves your odds. So she kept having children. My sister was born in October for mid-October, and then a year later plus to February I was born. Then a year plus later to April, my twin brothers were born. So I was just a little over 1. And then a year minus a week, the next boy was born. So the 5th child was born, and my oldest sister was 3.5. I was 2.25, and then there's a 1-year-old and a baby. And so that's a lot of little kids all at once. And my aunt tells a story that my dad hired an older lady who would come and help my mom with laundry, because the diapers, you didn't have disposable diapers, you had cloth diapers. And you washed them. And so that meant with 4 little boys in diapers, there were a lot of diapers. And my aunt says she came in once, and Mrs. Simpson was loading all these diapers in the washing machine, and she says, "I shudder to think what would happen if this ever broke down." So, and then 2 years later was another boy, and 2 years later was another boy. 3 years later was a girl. 2 years later, another girl. 2 years later, another girl. And 2 years later was the final boy. So 11 children. And I was the oldest boy. My sister was the oldest of us all. But being on the farm, there's work for us to do. And my dad spoke. He says, as boys tend to be, are competitive. And being the oldest brother, there's no way I would let any of my younger brothers beat me. And they were always bound and determined to see if they could. So we really out moving pipe was all hand lines, and we hustled. We would carry the pipe and then run back to get the next one. It was no lollygagging. And my dad laughed about it later. He says, "I had a good thing going. I did nothing to discourage it." But he farmed about 600 acres, which was a large amount there. I didn't realize it. Growing up, you just, whatever is, and you don't think about it being extraordinary or anything. It just is. Most of the neighbors farmed around 100 acres, but we had 4 parcels, and And then he also had some other land and bought and sold. But that was the farming. The summers occupied with farming. Potatoes and wheat and alfalfa were the main crops. And then about the time I left home, he started growing pinto beans and pink beans. So that was the farm. He loved the mountains. He loved skiing. He had bought property before he ever married my mother up in Sun Valley, Idaho. It was actually Ketchum. Sun Valley is what everybody's heard of. But Warm Springs is where one of the major ski lifts is now. And he had a cabin right there. And and they didn't even have a ski lift on our side of the mountain at the time. And they would go up the river run side and ski down, some of them on our side, and a little footbridge my dad had built. They'd ski across it, and a bus would pick them up and take them around. Then the ski company bought out a couple of the neighbors. One of them was the Pattersons. Patterson Pete and Susie Pete was my age, and Susie was a little older, and they both were great athletes. They both skied in the Olympics. So they bought the Pattersons out and the Cullers out, and the ski lift was put on right next to the property we had. My dad had some reverses in farming, but he always managed to push through. There's a lot of stories I could tell about that, but he decided he had to sell that land, and so we lived up there 2 years while he was working with the city and trying to different things, and so he had a couple of trailer houses he put down, and we lived in these trailer houses, and we could watch the skiers. And in the springtime, he took the family down to the farm and left me there 1 year with one of my younger brothers, and we were just there a week while he then came back and got us. And the season was kind of over, but the lifts were still running, and so these guys that really like to ski, they had built a ski jump on the uphill side of the creek, the side of the creek that was against the mountain, and then they would land on our property. Well, they had got this jump, and they start way up high and tuck, and so they had to be moving to clear the creek. And the first one, nobody even thought about leveling the snow off on our side. And the first guy that landed hit this rough snow, and he couldn't glide. He just hit it, and it stopped him, and it's like he exploded. His goggles flew off, his poles, he lost his, it was amazing. He had to be in good shape, or he would kill the normal person. And the guy running the ski lift went over and picked up the stuff on his side of the fence. And they got him stopped, and they got him tamped out smooth, and they could shoot down and land, jump the creek and land and ski. So, different memories like that just stick in my head. Yeah. So as growing up, another quick story about growing up. For sure. My dad, they were up in Seattle. Boeing was the big company up there, and there's a housing shortage. And so my dad and a couple of neighbors had an idea. They could put in a commercial trailer court where they provided the trailers. In other words, they put in apartments, so to speak, made out of trailers, and they called it Rocket Plaza. And every trailer had a name of a constellation or a star. And it was really classy. It had a big sign that said Rocket Plaza, and we went and lived there one winter when I was 5 years old, turned 6. And it was doing great business. And then at some point, the economy turned. Boeing lost a contract they thought they were going to get, and business really shut down. And this trailer court went from a full occupancy to vacancy, almost total. And so the partners had wanted out, so he was the sole proprietor. And so all of a sudden he had all these payments he had to make on these trailers and no income. So he began selling these trailers off the best he could everywhere. And he took them to wherever he could find a market. And one of them, he'd heard up in Skagway, Alaska, there was a need for houses, trailers. But how do you get them there? You could drive it, possibly, but that's a long drive. Or you take a ferry, but the ferries wouldn't let them put the trailers on. They were cars. And he found out somewhere up in Washington, I can't remember where it was, there was a ferry that had room. And so he drove in there, and the road was very windy and tight. And there was actually somebody else that had the same idea, but this trailer houses, by the time they got there, the bends were tight enough they had scraped off the siding on trees, tore them up. but my dad wasn't ever one to give up easy. And so he and a young man, Sonny Buck, who was driving with him, decided they could do this. And the only time they're allowed to take that road was on a Sunday and so they start out early on a Sunday morning. Dad drove all night to get them to the point and they had a chainsaw with them. And as they came to turn, there's a tree that cut the tree down. And they battled this all day long to get into that place to catch the ferry. And and sometimes they have to jack up the back of the trailer on a jack and then tip it to move the trailer over enough to get it. So they could get it on the bridge and different things. But they pulled in there and the trailer was in good shape. And they parked first in line to get on the ferry. And the next morning, he says there's a whole line of cars waiting. The ferry pulls in. They go to pull on the ferry, and they can't make the turn on the ferry. Once they get up on it, there's a bollard there. A bollard's a metal pipe that keeps you from... And the guy loading them says, stop, everybody, back them up. We got to get this off. And Dad says, you have a cutting torch? He says, I'm not backing this up. You have a cutting torch? He says, yeah, I just go get it. So he sent one of the people to get a cutting torch. He says, cut that thing off. And the man says, I'm not cutting it off. And Dad says, well, give it to me. And he cut off the bollard on this ferry. And then he said sheepishly later, he says, I didn't know he's the captain. My dad had been in the Navy in World War II. And so he had respect for captains. But anyway, he got this trailer on this ferry. And the word got out. There's this kind of crazy guy who wanted to get ferries up to trailers up to Skagway. And at one point they called him. And there was a ferry had been down into Seattle for repairs and was headed out. And because of one part of a route, it was empty. And they told him, you can put as many trailers on as you can fit. And my dad, telling me the story, put his hands up and goes, manna from heaven. And it just gave him enough of a breather that he was able to not go bankrupt. It's a special story of my dad's desire to never give up. Never. Yeah. So that's my heritage.
For sure. My next question for you is, how did you and your wife meet? What's that story?
Okay. As said, she moved in with some cousins at BYU. I was living in a little two-story house that was one street east of Main Street. And it was on a dead-end street that ended right at the soccer field. And we'd named it the dead end on that end, and some roommate called it the mortem endum, kind of a Latin dead end. And so that's where we're living, and we're going to church over at Provo High School. That was where we met. And one day, there's this young lady in Sunday school made a very insightful comment. And I don't want to sound negative about anybody, but I wasn't used to young women making that, really insightful comments. And so that caught my attention. And so afterwards, I went up to her and talked to her, but she was with a couple of her cousins, and they were really friendly and things. And so I got to know them, and she didn't know I wasn't already friends with her cousins. But I started going over to their apartment and hanging out occasionally, and got to know her, and eventually proposed. And so that's where we met, is at Provo High School as college students.
Yeah.
And a fun story is while I was courting her, her dad came down and met me, and he had a letter from Sweden from a mother's cousin. His mother had passed away, and he'd had it years before, but didn't know anybody that read Swedish. And he gave me the letter to read, and I was able to read it. So wow. I had a chance to make a good first impression.
For sure. Doesn't
hurt. But that's where we met, was at Provo. And she was working for the law school librarian at the J. Reuben Clark Law School at the time. And I was going to school in civil engineering.
Yeah.
And so we married that spring. I had a summer job surveying on the Navajo Reservation. So we moved to Winslow, Arizona. Everything we could haul in a little Chevy Chevette, which isn't a great deal. Worked there that summer, lived in an adobe apartment for a month. And then we had one of our great uncles had a trailer. He let us borrow a little travel trailer, which we lived in. And then that fall, I had always wanted to go to Utah State, but just guess I had to go to BYU to find her. So we transferred to Utah State, and I went to Utah State and graduated with a bachelor's and master's in irrigation engineering. So, and while we're at Utah State, we ended up having 3 of our 5 children. So, yeah.
Awesome. Maybe you would like to tell some story about your family.
Okay, so when we were living in Winslow, it's when our first son was started, and so we were up to school at Utah State, and the brand new regional hospital was open. The old hospital was just closed when we got there, so he was one of the first babies born in the new regional hospital there. I'm pretty sure with us having 3 in succession, was probably one of the first people to have 3 children there. But we were managing apartments at the time, and we first lived in a little house, and then we started managing apartments to help make ends meet. And Louise, we bought us a Selectric typewriter, which was the king of typewriters. Was one used we found, and she'd type papers for graduate students. And thank goodness she's a wonderful typist. But anyway, so we're managing apartments, and then we had another baby, and the owner says, well, if you have another one, we don't want you to stay as managers. And so when we were expecting our third, we found someplace else to live, and we let the managers know we were moving. And they said, oh, no, you can stay. They didn't care if we had a third one. They really loved Louise was a wonderful manager. But that's, so we had Bob. His name's Robert Charles. Robert's after, a family name, and Charles was Louise's grandfather. And then Maria just was the right name for her, and she's named Maria Louise. And then our next son was David Jonathan. We were going to name him Jonathan David. One of her grandfathers is Jonathan, but it just felt right to name him David Jonathan, and which kind of turned out nice. My mom always wanted a David, but never did. Out of 7 boys, not one of them was David. My dad's youngest sister, wonderful lady, Bobby Ann Hunsaker, her oldest son was David, so she was pleased that we had a David. I had a good friend whose name was David, and he was pleased to have a David. So we had a lot of mileage out of naming that second boy David. And then I had a job, finished school, got a job out in the Uinta Basin with the Soil Conservation Service. And there our 4th child was born, was Keziah, just before I got a job with the power company. But we lived 2 years out in the Uinta Basin, and that was a choice memory. We had some land. We had Dad. He had a bunch of ponies. Probably ought to tell that story here shortly. But he had these ponies, and we were able to. He gave us some that we could trade to a friend of Louise's, a couple of quarter horse Arabian mixes we had. So we had a gelding and a mare, and so we had horses, we got some bummer lambs, we had a couple of bummer lambs, we had guinea hens, we had chickens, we had ducks, we had a goat, we had a dog. We lived out in the country, something we've always loved doing, and that's the only time in our lives, in our married life, that we've actually succeeded at doing it. But we were there, and it was cold in the winter out in the Uinta Basin, and the house we had baseboard electric heat, which is very expensive because you don't have, it's not a heat pump, there's no gains, it's just 1 for 1 on the electricity, and it could run you hundreds of dollars, and we were still trying to make ends meet. And so I acquired a wood stove, a Fisher wood stove, and a neighbor had a heavy oil-filled pipe, and I got 5 sections that I cut 5 holes, made a template on both sides of the stove. So I put the pipe through and welded them so air could flow through, but the flames would heat it. And then I took some sheet metal and made it so I could put a fan on the back, and it'd blow across the back of the stove, around to one side, through the pipes, and out the other end. And a bunch of elm trees on the property. I was able to cut those and some dry and make great firewood. And I could put that elm wood in there, and that stove would get hot enough you could look through the end and just see the pipes just barely starting to glow. and it'd kick out a lot of heat. And I cut it was in the basement, and I cut a hole in the floor in the living room above and made a grate and put on that so the heat could rise up. And that's how we heated the house from a wood stove. And it worked great. And other than we'd run the baseboard heating in the bathroom, but the bedrooms didn't matter if they're cold. You can bundle up. And so we just lots of memories. The kids loved it. And we had good friends out there. And then we moved, like I said, the Graham-Rudman Act. There was an act in Congress about balancing budget and about having government shutdowns. And so if there was a government shutdown, we would have had to leave without pay. And they said it's not probable, but it's possible. And so I'm facing that thinking, man, I've got a house payment and everything. I don't know what I'll do if that happens. And I got a phone call asking me if I was interested in a job with Utah Power. There had been someone who had been running they had a irrigation pump testing program, and that person had taken a promotion to work as a manager in an office. And so they were looking for someone. And they called Utah State because they had people from Utah State work with irrigation engineering. And so they contacted them, and a professor up there gave them my name. And so I got called, and I went in for an interview, and I got hired. And for that job. And the fellow that hired me said, I don't know anything about this. You're going to have to learn it from the previous guy. And I knew the irrigation stuff. And so I was trained on the job with a couple of people who did that kind of work. And then he says, I'll train you on the rest of the job, which was regulation. And over time, the irrigation pump testing went away and regulation became my career. Nothing I studied for, but the engineering background was useful to help me understand how the electrical system works. But that became the career as I worked for Utah Power, and they were bought by Pacific Power, and I worked with people from Portland, and eventually the fellow up there asked me to apply for a job for someone, and I says, I don't want to move to Portland, Mike. He said, well, just apply. And I did, and he hired me, and so I moved to Portland.
Yeah.
And then eventually I was able to move back to Utah in the same job. And so I spent 37 years with what now is known as Pacific Core and Rocky Mountain Power. So I was a specialist in a very niche thing, such that when I did retire, they hired me back as a contractor to train my replacement because nobody did what I did.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a nice thing to know that I felt like I was useful anyway.
For sure.
That's career-wise. We went on to have another daughter, Erin. So we have 5 children. Boy, girl, and then girl. And when we were living in American Fork, or just north of American Fork at the time when she was born, and the doctor did an ultrasound and knew we were going to have a little girl. And he asked us what we thought we were going to have. Well, I always just said, well, it's a boy now. We had boy, girl, now it's a boy again.
Yeah.
I said, well, it's a boy. And he didn't know I was just saying something. He thought I really was confident as a boy, and he knew it wasn't a boy. And so he asked me, well, what if it isn't? And I flippantly says, well, we'll send it back. And he became very concerned and started counseling me. And I realized he took me serious. And I had to say, no, doctor, I'm kidding. Well, we don't care. We just hope the baby's healthy. But I remember I did. It was kind of funny when I realized I had him very worried. I said, no, it's okay. And she was born, and then she was about 3 when we moved to Portland, and she grew up there. We were there 13 years, and it was quite the experience there. We lived in a rental house for a while, and then we were able to buy this house. It was a larger home that had been built by a man for himself. He was a contractor, and it was a beautiful home. It had natural wood. It had coat ceilings. It had wood things the walls were plaster walls, and so you didn't want to put nails in, but it had a place to hang pictures on the wall. There's a rail that goes around that you could hang hooks over it. They make special hooks to hang on that for hanging pictures. It had a full basement, and and then upstairs, but the attic was not. The upstairs, the roof was sloped, and then it had built on the back of the front. It was sloped, and it was hot because it only had 2x4 depth between the ceiling and the roof with shingles. And eventually, we tore the old roof off, 3 or 4 layers of shingles, and then I put up with 2x8s on side, and so I made a bigger space in the roof. And then I put heavy, high insulation bats, 6-inch bats, so I had airspace above that, and put good ventilation in, and it made the house so much easier to heat and cool. And then we had the windows replaced, and it was just a lovely home. We had lots of students live with us. A friend in the ward placed students from Japan, and so we had students from Japan live with us 10 months at a time, and then others would be just a few weeks. But it was a place, the word got out. Our youngest is very social, and students are, like anybody, they don't want to be seen as not able to talk the language, and they're self-conscious, but not with a child. So having a precocious younger child, it was a really good place for them to practice their English. And they were very accepted. They lived with us, and they would call me dad, and they call Louise mom, and they would talk to her. But the Asian girls don't really talk with the men. So they didn't talk with me much, but they were pleasant. But if they had a question, it was always to mom. But we were down the hill from the Bible Temple College up there, which is a big Protestant. All the Protestants would gather there for big meetings, and this one girl that was living with us was invited to a meeting up there, and she asked me if I'd go with her, and I said sure. So we went up, and it was very revival-like. And after a while, she says, "Could we go?" And I says, "Yeah, we can go." So we left, and on our way walking back home, I says, "What did you think of it?" And she says, "Well, it's kind of like the pep rallies at school." And I thought, you got it. We're good. And this young lady's coming to Salt Lake here in a few months, is going to stop by and see us. So kind of neat. Yeah. So the kids are all raised. I don't know what to say. We're very happy. They're all good kids. None of them done anything foolish. My oldest son's never married, but he's a wonderful young man. Well, he's in his 40s. And our next is Maria, and she's married, and they have 6, 3 boys and 3 girls, and they live up here in Syracuse. And the next is David, and he and his wife, and they have 6, and they live back in the Detroit area. He's in nuclear physics, and he's doing work with that with a university. I'm not sure exactly what it is. I was one day when I asked him about something with nuclear physics, he started to explain it, and he finally says, "Well, Dad, I don't know how to explain it simple enough for you." So I don't know really what he does. Yeah. But I'm proud of him and his family and the grandkids, and then Kazai, who lives with us, and then our baby daughter lives down in Provo, and she's expecting her 5th. So, and her husband happens to be the manager over the BYU Creamery.
Oh wow!
So whenever they come to family get-togethers, they generally bring some damaged carton of ice cream or something. Yeah. He has access to anybody has access to it, but he's right there, so it's pretty easy for him to pick some up for us.
For sure. So. Yeah. All right. Well, I have one more question from me, and that is, looking back at your life, what are the things that you're most proud of, or that you're most grateful for accomplishing?
Wow. Well, I guess the thing I'm most grateful for, my dad was in World War II on a submarine, which was not a great place to be. If the submarine got sunk, most everybody died on it. And they were smelly. They were diesel powered. They ran along the surface, but if you couldn't be fully on surface, you had to use the snorkel. It was you got a lot of diesel fumes in there. And the best water went to the electric batteries, which the diesels charged electric batteries. So he learned to drink coffee because that's one way. And he also, he learned, and then afterwards farming, he learned to like a cold beer on a hot day. And never was into hard alcohol or anything, I don't think. But when he was dating my mom, her dad had been inactive and had smoked and things, or did at the time. And one day they had been up to mutual friends' wedding. She had been a roommate with the bride, and he was a friend with the groom. And they'd been up there, and they'd had a little bit, the men had had a little bit to drink. And they're driving home, and my dad pulled the car over and said he needed to stop. He didn't feel like he's always had good sense that way, to not drive when he wasn't capable. And he asked her to drive. She says, no, we'll just sit here till you're ready. She says, I grew up with this, and I won't live with it. If you're interested in me, you're going to have to make a decision. So he told a friend, had this lady he was dating, and he really wanted to marry her, but the only place she was going to marry is in the temple, and he couldn't get a temple recommend. And the friend says, go talk to the stake president. So he went and talked to the stake president. The stake president says, Fred, you've always been a man of your word. If you'll tell me you're through drinking coffee and alcohol, I'll give you a recommend right now. And my dad says, I'm through. And he was through. I'm so grateful. My mom stood up for his standards, because too many young women are afraid they'll drive somebody off. But they love them, and they're upright in their heart. And I'm so grateful that he had the courage and the decision and the wisdom to do it. So all of us are raised in the church, in an active ward, in a small farming community. I don't know what better blessing we could have had, and it wouldn't have happened if my mom and my dad hadn't done what they did. And so I would say that's the thing I'm most grateful for, is being raised in the church because of two people who made the right decision.
I'm so glad I included the word grateful in my question.
That's my accomplishments. I don't know. I've done lots of things. I'm kind of a handyman around the house, but I guess my biggest accomplishment is getting my wife to marry me.
Makes sense. Yeah. Awesome. Well, now we have what will be the closing tradition on this podcast, and that is the question from the journal for this podcast's namesake. And because it's the first episode, and there was no previous guest to write the question, I've had your wife write the question.
Oh dear.
And here it is. If time, money, distance, and health were not issues, what would you like to do?
Oh, wow. I'd like to do a lot of things. I like horses. I've never been much of a horseman, but I think it'd be fun to just go riding horses a lot, up in places where you could ride, out in the mountains and things like that. I'd love to go to Switzerland, where my wife served her mission, to see those places. I'd like to go snorkeling in the tropics. I guess those are those three major things. I go riding horses somewhere, and help on a cattle drive would be great. I've done a little bit of that, gotten real saddle sore once, but I've still kept my saddle. My dad gave me a saddle when I was a teenager, and my brothers lost theirs, got rid of them, but I've never gotten rid of mine. So probably something that'll never happen, but yeah. Go riding horses, snorkeling in the tropics, and tour Switzerland.
That's awesome. Well, I think that it was a great conversation. I'm really happy to have learned a lot more about you.
Well, thank you. I'm sure I was supposed to do the talking, but it felt like I've done a lot of talking, though. Not much of a conversation.
You're right. But I'm grateful for that, too. Alrighty. Well, I'll have you write a question in here, and that'll be the end. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, and thank you.